with a thank you to the Native Learning Center. Maybe we could take a minute and thank the staff for their work and their effort the past couple of days. We really appreciate the opportunity that you guys do, the work that you guys do, making resources like this available to tribes and tribal communities, making the opportunity available for networking opportunities like this. And this is a resource that they make available that's free, and including on their web platform, their podcast,
Yes.
and it includes a tremendous amount of resources. So again,
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you to the Native Learning Center.
Thank you.
So the resource that we're going to talk about today is not specifically for clean energy, but it absolutely can be used alongside those types of projects. But I think to start the discussion kind of high level, this is a resource that we're talking about that is for anything from clean energy to admin facilities, to clinics, to schools, to expansion of your behavioral health facility, to a broadband project that you have going on. So again, this is a funding resource that's going to fit extremely well with some of those other ones that have been talked about today, but it's also broader than that, where it can be very helpful for lots of different project types. And I think the other point that I want to make to start is that the value that we see in this for tribes and tribal communities is that this is one of the resources, again, that doesn't have to be paid back. So if you're thinking about how to maximize your own dollars and to get a project off the ground, I think it starts with using as many tools in the toolbox that you have to fit those together to use other people's money to not have to pay for a project. And this is certainly one of those tools. So again, when we're starting to talk about new markets tax credits as a resource, again, for anything that could include clean energy, but maybe it's a workforce training center, or maybe it's a business investment to buy and expand. The Iowa tribe is talking about that business in Colorado to expand solar testing. Absolutely an eligible use where new markets tax credits can be used for something like that. I would think very, very broadly, because there's a very limited short list of things that you can't do with new markets tax credits. I'm going to hit on those in a little bit, but the list of things that you can do is much, much bigger. Again, anything from infrastructure to helping fund operations and reserves on a project to, the bricks and sticks of a school or an admin facility. So our work at Travois, to give you a little introduction, started in 1995, really helping tribes leverage this program called low-income housing tax credits. Low-income housing tax credits was established by Congress in 1986 and now has become by far the biggest resource for affordable housing development in this country. By far, hands down. It's helped create over 3.5 million homes across the country. But it wasn't until 1995 that the first tribe, the Red Lake Reservation Housing Authority in Minnesota, had used this program that Congress had intended to become the biggest resource for affordable housing development in the country. So our take continues to be that, okay, if this resource is out there on the housing tax credit side, intended to be the biggest resource to help expand affordable housing development opportunities, why in the world did it take 10 years for tribes to be able to access it? Similarly, the same question applies on the new markets tax credit side. So new markets tax credits is part of the IRS code. It came about kind of as a supplemental program to the low-income housing tax credit program. Low-income housing tax credits, ideal for rental housing development, paying for around 60 to 70 to 80% of a big housing project, a rental project, so maybe $7 million on a $10 million project. New markets tax credits is not going to provide that much subsidy. It's likely going to cover 20 to 30% of a project's cost, but in both instances, it does not have to be paid back. So on the housing side, we've helped in this capacity on over 200 tribal projects, over $1.2 billion of project cost, and that $893 million number, that's the important number on the housing side. That's investment into tribal communities using the low-income housing tax credit program. Again, that's the portion that does not have to be paid back. That experience on the housing side led us to realize that tribes should be using this program on the economic development side in the same capacity. The reality is it continues to be, frankly, underutilized, and Treasury has not done enough to expand access to equitably ensure that this pool of resources is available for tribal projects. We're going to talk about how it gets into tribal projects, but this resource directly through Travois, we're not the only one that has done new markets tax credit deals. We're a CDE that has done 38, $500 million of project cost, but it's provided a leveraging resource covering about $118 million worth of cost across those tribal projects, and we're going to talk about a few of those today. So, again, when we're starting a conversation, I think it's absolutely perfectly allowable, plausible to start a conversation about new markets tax credits, about clean energy. It's absolutely an allowable use. It's anything from microgrids, maybe 5 million plus, to big systems. Maybe it's one component of a system, maybe it's one component of a multi-phase project. All of those are absolutely new markets tax credit eligible. But maybe you're thinking about, okay, we have some ARPA dollars. We're looking on getting a wellness facility off the ground. Maybe there's a big broadband grant that the community has received, and maybe there's $30 million worth of money on the table. Could you leverage that alongside new markets tax credits and scale up that project, do even more, and basically use that resource that maybe you already have available to take advantage of this other program? I think the answer is, in a lot of instances, absolutely yes. Head Start, admin facilities, schools, clinics, great examples. So maybe you're taking an existing daycare facility and you're just rehabbing it and expanding it to accommodate a bigger program. Maybe you're doing a language school and right now you're serving 30, 40 kids, but you're trying to build a school that is really, you want to accommodate 200 kids and continue to grow that school, that language preservation school. All of those are absolutely the type of projects that are eligible to use new markets tax credits. Straight healthcare facilities, ideal projects to use new markets tax credits, but maybe it's a specialized care facility, maybe it's a treatment facility, maybe it's an expansion, maybe you have a health clinic and you're expanding and you're going to continue providing behavioral health services. And that portion of the project, the expansion, is $10 million. That's an ideal type project to use new markets tax credits. Typically what we tell our clients and what our average project size, I think across the country on a new markets tax credit deal, is right around the $12 to $15 million range. So typically we tell our clients that it's best suited for projects 5 million and above because of the transaction costs and the legal costs. I'm looking at Pilar in the back, and I know that this is not an easy transaction by any means, so there are significant transaction costs that go into a project like this. So it's not something for like a few $100,000 transaction. There's no hard and fast rule about what that size of project can be though. So maybe it's $4 million, maybe it's $6 million. I think in this 12 to 15 is sort of the sweet spot. You can go much bigger, and we're going to talk about some examples, some really unique opportunities where multiple CDEs, these entities that get new markets tax credits, can put funding into an even larger project. But I would say most groups are going to put around $10 to $12 million of new markets tax credit allocation into a given project. And again, that's going to translate into benefit of about 20%, 30% of the project's cost for you. So again, there's these two big programs that are out there. Low-income housing tax credits, LIHTC. I'm looking at the gentleman from Red Lake. I know Red Lake's done 14 different tax credit projects through the Red Lake Reservation Housing Authority. Probably built 300 plus homes at Red Lake. And again, like 70 to 80% of that has been paid for by the program. Pasquiyaki, they're working on their 10th tax credit project on the housing side right now. So much deeper subsidy on the housing tax credit side compared to new markets tax credits. But new markets tax credits kind of came about from Congress the same way. Congress said, hey, there's this program out there called low-income housing tax credits. It's working very, very well. What could we do to expand something on the community economic development side? So what they did is they basically came up with a totally separate program. The similarities end at the fact that they're both a federal credit, but this program has been around since 2000, compared to the housing tax credit program that's been around since 1986. So unlike some of the programs that were mentioned yesterday that are kind of new opportunities, these are well established. There's a significant track record of tribes using and benefiting from these resources. They're not necessarily new, but it's a resource that should be on your radar to think about whether or not it makes sense to get your project done. I think the other thing that I really appreciate in a conversation like this is that tribes can't make good decisions about what is the best funding mechanism if you don't know that those funding mechanisms are out there and available. So you need access to all of the different tools in your toolbox to say, hey, this one makes sense in this instance. You know, I'm going to pursue this funding resource in this instance. But if you don't know that or don't know how to access new markets tax credits into your deal, then it makes it very challenging to evaluate whether it's a good business decision. I think the other challenge that we have right now, the issue that we have with Native American Bank, with the Treasury Department, and I'm looking if anyone from Native American Bank is here in the room. I don't see them right now, but they're also a CDE. So feel free to talk to them directly. They're applying to the Treasury Department and have an application pending, just as we do for an allocation of new markets tax credits. Now, our argument to the Treasury is that there needs to be a dedicated pool of resources of new markets tax credits specifically to benefit tribal projects. That has not happened in 4 years. If that's Travois, great, but it needs to be an entity that understands tribal communities, whether that's Native American Bank, whether that's the Chickasaw Nation CDE, whether that's Citizen Potawatomi. There are entities that we're going to talk about here today that are applying to the Treasury with the intent of receiving new markets tax credits solely with the mission of deploying them into tribal projects. So our CDE, Travois CDE, that's how it's been for all of our allocation. All allocation, any allocation that we've received has been deployed exclusively into Indian country economic development projects. Now, Treasury's response right now will be, oh, well, there are groups out there that have allocation committed to tribal projects. However, if you ask Treasury who those groups are or how you go about finding where that resource is to be deployed into tribal projects, they won't tell you that information. So our point is that there needs to be access, clearly defined access. The pool of resources needs to be on the table. Tribes need to understand where to go to get it. And then that collectively is going to build the institutional capacity of all tribes to understand whether or not this is a good fit for their particular program or project. Again, the value that we see in these programs is that these are equity programs. They're not debt. So they're not grants. They're a tax credit in exchange for money into your project to make your project possible. So there is a financial benefit that the tax credit partner receives. They invest in this credit. They partner to buy this credit from you. You don't need the tax credits. What you need is that equity to make your project possible. So it's different from a grant program where you're applying for a grant through the DOE directly. In this instance, this tax credit comes into the project, and then you essentially, lack of a better term, sell that credit in exchange for money to benefit your project. We'll talk about how that works.
And how much does that credit sell for usually?
We'll get to that in just a minute. So, new markets tax credits. This is an allocation. It's been an annual allocation. $5 billion is on the table again this year in 2023. $5 billion of allocation was awarded last year as well. There are about 200 CDEs, and this acronym here is really important. CDEs, Community Development Entities. So in the new markets tax credit world, the way it works is that you as a tribe, you don't apply directly to the Treasury Department. Instead, that responsibility is designated by Congress to CDEs. So all CDEs across the country have to get Treasury approval to become one. That makes you eligible to apply for and deploy new markets tax credits. But all CDEs, there's about 200 of them across the country. They all have slightly different missions or geographies. So, for instance, EcoTrust is one in Washington State. They're a CDE, and they focus all of their projects on the upper Northwest region. So tribes aren't precluded from working with them in that instance, but they all have different missions of different projects that they serve and different geographies. So another example is Clearinghouse CDFI is an example. They're one that has done tribal projects before. They're familiar with tribal projects, but that's not all that they serve. They're in Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California region. So they do lots of projects, and if you're in one of those geographies, you could partner with that CDFI to use some of their new markets tax credit allocation. Now, our CDE, Travois CDE, is different in that we're a national CDE. We're not constrained by one particular state or region, but we've committed 100% of our allocation in the past to tribal projects. So our allocation has benefited projects on that map that you saw before, everything in red. So everything from Oregon, Washington, Maine, Michigan, where tribes are located is where our allocation can be deployed. So it's two things: finding a CDE that has allocation, finding a CDE that has allocation that kind of fits with your geography, and then also finding allocation for the particular project type that you're talking about. So another example is that some CDEs, they may only do rural manufacturing facilities or urban manufacturing facilities. So they might be in your area, but they may say, hey, your tribal admin facility, that's not the right project niche for us. So you got to find a CDE, number one, that kind of works in your project area, but also serves your project type to kind of match up and figure out not all CDEs are going to be a good fit. Our take would be that any project that we're talking about today certainly could be a fit for Native American Bank. It could be a good fit for Travois CDE. It could be a good fit for the Chickasaw Nation's CDE, because all of their requests to the Treasury Department are exclusively for tribal projects and to benefit tribal communities. So this past, it's already February, end of January, applications went into the Treasury Department for a request from this $5 billion pot of new markets tax credits. Our CDE submitted a request for $60 million. I think Native American banks maybe in the same range, maybe $60 to $100 million. Chickasaw Nation CDEs in the same range as well. So we're now in the Treasury kind of pipeline application review stage for review of these applications that will then be awarded directly to CDEs. As a CDE, it's then our responsibility to deploy those funds directly into projects. But not all 200 of those will get allocation. So it becomes this kind of matching game, this relationship game of who has allocation, who has a project, that kind of fits with the project profile that they're trying to fund. And that's why we're going to talk about the role of the relationship in this whole thing. The other thing that I would highlight here is that we would expect, if you're talking with council, I would say that it's fair to assume a 20 to 25% net benefit after the fees and expenses are paid to benefit and offset your project costs. I would say 20 to 25% net benefit, and that could do a couple of different things. It could help enable you to expand up the scope of your project by, say, another 20%. So maybe in the VE process that the great team from TEPA was talking about, they were talking about value engineering. And they were talking about how, maybe originally the budget was $8 million and the project came in at $10 million. So a whole bunch of things had to get cut out of the project to make it viable. New markets tax credits is absolutely a viable source to help fill or enable you to put back in that portion of the cost that you had to take out in the VE process. The other thing that it can help you do is it can help take out tribal contribution of committed funds. So let's say you have a $10 million project, $2 million of that is contribution from the tribe, another $8 million of philanthropic and grant sources. Maybe there's some hard debt on the project, but you can use New Markets tax credits to take out that tribal contribution and put that 20 to 25% back in your own pocket. You know, another way to think about it is maybe you have a fully funded ARPA project and you have a admin facility that's in the pipeline, and you say, well, we think it's fully sourced. We think that our construction numbers are good. We have a really good solid handle on what the numbers are going to be and how they're going to come back. Well, on a New Markets tax credit transaction, you could add in, you know, let's say you could add in another $600,000 reserve, and then maybe another $1.5 million that you want to do like a park expansion, walking trails around that facility, some type of really nice outdoor amenity. That could be added onto the project, again, kind of enabling you to scale up that scope to benefit from another $2-3 million on a $10 million project. But I would start with an assumption that it's not going to be the primary funding resource. It can't pay for the entire project cost, but it can be very, very valuable to help provide and offset 20 to 30% of the overall project's costs. So again, CDEs, all of them operate a little bit differently, but typically CDEs all have the same challenge, is that they have far more projects that could benefit from New Markets tax credits compared to the amount of allocation that they have. So in our instance, we rely on our advisory board to help us determine and help us assess which projects are going to be most impactful from a community impact perspective. And I say that because not all projects are created equal as far as community impacts. You might have a C-store that is extremely, extremely important from an economic perspective, but it's not going to employ necessarily a ton of people. And, you know, if you compare that to like a language preservation project that has a workforce training component to it, you know, the community impacts of those two projects aren't necessarily the same. So CDEs, they have to evaluate how many jobs are going to be created, what the overall community impacts are of those projects, and really like the bigger story with that project, because when they go back in to communicate and report to the Treasury, that's one of the things that we're committing to, that, you know, certain number of community impacts have been achieved. So that's why we rely on our advisory board. I think this is the same structure that most CDEs use, because there's oftentimes far bigger pipeline of projects that could use the resource than what's end up available to actually put into a project. So again, super simplified terms of thinking about how this process works. CDEs, they apply to the Treasury Department. That's not your job. You don't have to worry about that date or anything. Your job as a developer is finding CDEs that have allocation to match your project type. Treasury then awards this pool of $5 billion to CDEs across the country, but all CDEs, they don't all get allocation. So, you know, again, we didn't have allocation last year. There hasn't been a tribally specific CDE that's had allocation in several years. That's why we're advocating for that to change with the Treasury, that there needs to be a dedicated resource out there specifically for tribal projects so that tribes can understand how to get it, where to go to get it, where to get the training, and so that collectively everyone can better utilize this resource. So then as a CDE, again, we're no different than what Native American Bank would be doing, or Clearinghouse CDFI. It's our role to deploy that allocation of New Markets tax credits directly into projects. And so we've submitted our application to the Treasury Department. I think it's actually $60 million this year. So we would anticipate that that's going to fund 5 to 6 tribal projects with a New Markets tax credit allocation of around 10 to 12 million per project. So just to give you a couple examples of projects where we've worked with our allocation or helped find allocation through another entity like Native American Bank or Chickasaw Nation CDE. This is at Coeur d'Alene, their health entity, Merriman Health. And so what they did here with this project was they really wanted to create this kind of world-class recreational facility. to get the kids in the door, to give them a safe space to come in. There's a water slide, there's a pool, there's a basketball court, gymnasium. But really that was the pretext to provide comprehensive wraparound services to the youth in the community. Anyone here from Coeur d'Alene? Okay. So on this particular project, the supportive services is as critical a piece of the facility itself. So comprehensive behavioral health services, job training programs, education training programs, a whole host of other supportive services to kind of wrap around after the kids come in this kind of world-class facility. And you can see here, this was a $20 million project, about a $6.4 million equity benefit using New Markets tax credits. That's the portion that doesn't have to be paid back. This is another great example at Colville. Colville's done several New Markets tax credit projects, one including their admin facility, which was a much bigger project, about $44 million. On this particular project, no culturally appropriate treatment options nearby at Colville. Anyone from Colville in the room? So tribal members have to go all the way to Spokane for treatment. So they said, how do we do this better by providing this service directly to our tribal membership? Absolutely an eligible New Markets tax credit project, a $19.7 million project, about a $5.3 million equity benefit using New Markets tax credits. So there's a very short list of things that you can't do with New Markets tax credits, and I'm not even really going to focus much on this list. You can't use it for agricultural purposes as far as buying agricultural land. But I know that we've talked with a number of groups here, and one of those is like processing of some type of, maybe it's soybeans, and you're trying to get those to a different market. You're trying to clean those and expand your capacity. So for things like equipment and facilities and processing, New Markets tax credit is absolutely eligible. If you're doing a fish processing plant, example, we did a project in Alaska where lots of supply, not enough ability to continue to bring more of that to the market. So they used New Markets tax credits to expand that capacity of the facility. You just can't use it to purchase like the agricultural land itself. You can't use it for gaming directly, but hospitality on the same site, absolutely eligible. So Coyote Valley, they did a hotel adjacent to their casino gaming operation, absolutely eligible to use it for hospitality. Again, like this list is pretty short, so you can't do liquor stores, massage parlors, and they really want you using the low-income housing tax credit program as the resource for low-income rental housing, and then use this program, New Markets tax credits, for things like community facilities that we're talking about. Anyone from Porch Creek in the room? Okay, I just randomly picked a group to see what their geography would look like, and it turned out that they were a great example. So New Markets tax credits does have a geographic eligibility requirement to it. So unlike the housing tax credit program where you kind of compete in this competition and your geography doesn't preclude you from applying, there may be different factors like proximity to amenities and services on the housing tax credit side, but there is a geographic eligibility component on the New Markets tax credit side. So this is really, really important because you can see here that all of the tracts in white are not eligible to use New Markets tax credits. But everything in green is automatically eligible under the Treasury's designation to use New Markets tax credits. So is the person from Shoshone-Bannock still in the room? So another great example. So Bannock County is the one on the north reservation split by the county line that Bannock is to the north.
Bannock and Howard.
Yeah. So Bannock qualifies, Bingham does not. So where your admin facility is there is literally right on that line. So it's extremely important and valuable if you know that up front, because if it comes down to putting your location of your project in one of those two areas and it makes no sense geographically, like makes no difference, you're going to want to locate it on the north side of the Bannock County line, because that way the project is automatically eligible to use New Markets tax credits. So if you get too far down that path, maybe you figure this out later, figure out this resource is available. If you're in a white area, then it becomes much, much more challenging to use this funding resource. So again, this is a publicly available database. I can easily explain to you how to get to this mapping tool. If you go to the Treasury's website, you can put in New Markets Tax Credit Treasury Mapper, and then the key is that you just have to, there's a layer that you have to select, and you have to select New Markets Tax Credits so that green layer shows up as eligible. Or the other very easy thing to do is tell me the address of where your project might be located, and in 5-10 minutes I can say, hey, yeah, here's a map of your area, everything in your area qualifies. There's more instances. You'd be surprised how many instances end up like this, where a tribe may assume that they're in one particular designation, but they're literally like on the boundary or across the street from an eligible or ineligible tract. Another technical consideration here is on the left is this metro versus non-metro designation. So when CDEs, community development entities, apply for New Markets Tax Credits, they're saying to the Treasury, hey, we're going to allocate a certain percentage of our projects to non-metro or metro projects. So for our allocation, our request this year, 90% of that would be committed to non-metro projects. And that's important because Standing Rock, anyone in the room from Standing Rock? Standing Rock. So Standing Rock, you would think, how in the world is that metro? But sure enough, Treasury has determined that Fort Yates Standing Rock Reservation is metro as it relates to New Markets Tax Credits. So that's a more technical provision, but it does relate to who has the ability to fund your project, because CDEs are only committing a certain portion to the metro versus non-metro designation. Does that make sense? So let's look at $11.5 million healthcare project, but you could easily replace healthcare project with clean energy project or admin facility or whatever it is. This structure would be exactly the same in that scenario. The first thing, again, that I'm going to repeat is that this is not going to be the only funding source. So we know that you're working on a capital stack. Maybe that's these other DOE grants. Maybe it's philanthropic funds. Maybe there's hard debt on the project. Maybe there's tribal contribution. Maybe there's ARPA dollars on the table that have already been committed. All of those are going to make up what's called the leverage funds. So you're still going to have a significant stack of capital that's non-New Markets Tax Credit proceeds. But we assume that in this case there's a gap on the project, or again, like you could benefit from another $2 million of cost to expand that project up, or put in a reserve that's funded with New Markets Tax Credit reserve proceeds to benefit the project long term. Lots of flexibility on how it's structured. So it looks something like this. We took our $11.5 million project, and on the left is what we're going to call our leverage funds. Leverage funds in a New Markets deal, that's basically all the other combined sources of capital that they're making up the capital stack. So again, philanthropic funds, hard debt, DOE grant, and tribal contribution from the general operating fund of the casino. In this instance, we'll call that the $8.4 million. On the right, this is the New Markets Tax Credit proceeds into the project. So these have to flow through the CDE. So in this instance, we would form a Travois New Markets Investment Fund specifically for this project, and this is a requirement of how Treasury set up the program. The CDE fees are paid out of the New Markets Tax Credit proceeds. So we're calling this an $11.5 million qualified equity investment, a New Markets Tax Credit project, for lack of a better term. And what ends up happening is you end up with two loans that flow through the structure. You have a senior loan, $8.4 million, ties with the same amount of leverage funds. The legal and accounting costs come out of the secondary loan, but the benefit ultimately to the tribe is that this loan is forgiven after the 7-year compliance period. So yes, you're paying a very low amount of interest, maybe 1%, 1.5% interest only on that loan. There's fees that are paid to the CDE over the 7-year period, but at the end of the day, if you start with a $2.6 million benefit and all of those other fees are taken out after the 7 years, interest included, you have a $2 million net benefit after everything is paid out on this $11.5 million transaction. So again, like that's how we get to a 20 to 25% net benefit on a project in the scale of, $5 to $10 million. As you get bigger, a $15 million project is going to ultimately benefit you more, potentially, because oftentimes that legal expense on a $15 million transaction could be the same as it is on a $3 or a $5 million transaction. So you get more economies of scale, assuming that there's allocation of new markets tax credits available to fund it. Now, another important note would be that, let's say you have a $25 million project, you can still use new markets tax credits even if there isn't allocation that's the exact same size of your project. So you could say, hey, we've been pushing this project forward. We have this $20 million project. We found a CDE that could give us $10 million of allocation on a $20 million project. That's still absolutely allowable. Now, that's no longer like a 30% benefit, but it's still, $2 million in your own pocket that you could fund, you could deploy into something else, you could put into operations of the project, you could, invest somewhere else. $2 million in your own pocket is better than, $2 million that you have to put in yourself. So a couple technical considerations on how this works is that the New Markets Tax Credit Program does require that you would form a special, tribal LLC, a special purpose entity that's going to be technically the owner of that building, that tax credit project at the end of our structure. So again, maybe that's the clean energy project, that's the clinic, that's the admin facility. That special purpose entity is required under the requirements of the New Markets Tax Credit Program. And then that entity is technically that owns this qualified active low income community business, the Qualic B. So in Congress's infinite wisdom, they also put in there all these crazy acronyms and structure and just make it more complicated than what it is. But the qualified active low income community business, the Qualic B, that's the project at the end of the day that we're talking about. So what would happen then is that the tribe provides a lease, a long-term lease, maybe a 25 plus 25 year on trust land, to that Qualic B, the qualified active low-income community business. And then technically what happens is the project, the New Markets Tax Credit transaction, builds the building, leverages the equity, draws down the equity, but it's going to lease that back to the tribe, and it's going to be the tribe that's providing the social services or the admin services. Maybe they're leasing it to the healthcare provider, but technically this entity is owned by this special purpose LLC that's formed specifically for this transaction. Now, I think that this is absolutely critical, and I'm kind of, again, looking at Pilar. I know she's had some experience with New Markets Tax Credits. If there's any other feedback in the room right now, I don't want to sugarcoat that this is too good to be true. There are real risks related to this, and I think that the complexity of it is one. What I can say is that because it's new doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, and that what tribes have continued to demonstrate every single day is the great work that you're doing every single day. And just because it's new doesn't mean that it's not a good fit for what you're trying to do if it can help make a project happen. Now, on the compliance side, this is what it looks like on the New Markets Tax Credit side. This is much, much different from the housing tax credit side, where you really have to look at and think about the tenants that are moving into that home and the ongoing compliance for an even longer period of time. On a New Markets Tax Credit transaction, that compliance period is 7 years total. So in those 7 years, you can't physically move your school to a non-qualified census tract. So if you're at Shoshone-Bannock and you build a wellness facility on the north side of the county line, you can't pick that building up and move it across the street into the non-qualified geography. Never going to happen. That's an extremely easy one to meet. The next one is that you do have to maintain a separate set of books for that entity. It becomes a component unit of the tribe, but it will have a separate set of audited books for the transaction itself. The other thing that you can't do is, Pasquiyaki has a couple New Markets Tax Credit projects. One's a cultural facility. They can't take the cultural facility and convert it into a liquor store in the 7-year period. So again, as long as you're not converting it into one of the prohibited uses, that's basically the short list of what you have to do to remain in compliance with the New Markets Tax Credit Program. We have not had a single tribal project that has ever been non-compliant or that has lost or had recapture of their New Markets Tax Credits. Because again, we're talking about a 7-year period in terms of real estate. I mean, you don't have to do anything and the project's still going to be there in 7 years. I think the other thing to think about is that, the question comes up like, what does this look like on the back end? So once the project is up and running, and once we have the cultural facility up and running, are we going to need to have additional staff dedicated specifically to like the management of this transaction? And I would say no, absolutely not. That might be the case on like a housing project, but this is something that there might be 3 hours of staff work quarterly to do some ongoing reporting about use of the facility and ongoing operations. But this is something that we would assume is pretty easily absorbed into, maybe this is the administration office's responsibility or the finance office's responsibility. Maybe it's the legal office, but you're not going to have a dedicated person just for the New Markets Tax Credit transaction. Now, maybe if you do 10 projects or 12 projects, that could be the case. But a single project or 2 projects or 3 projects, you're not going to have to hire someone specifically for the transaction. Now, that's totally different. Of course, you're going to have the staff that are occupying the facility. You're going to have, you're going to have the healthcare workers that are working in the clinic. That's totally separate. What I'm talking about is just like the day-to-day paperwork of managing the transaction, the reporting that has to happen on the New Markets Tax Credit transaction. That's not going to require a full-time employee. I'm going to stop there for 1 minute, and I know we have until 4:15, is that right? 3:15? Yeah. 4:15, 15? So before we kind of get into more specifics on like how you actually benefit from this resource and actually get it into your projects, what questions are you guys thinking about? Or go ahead. Michael. Question?
Thanks. Hi, Adam. First of all, I really respect what you do now that I understand it. Second of all, I wanted to ask about the 25 plus 25 year lease that you talked about.
Yeah.
Why would you need that if it's a 7-year compliance period?
That's a good question for the lawyers and the tax credit investors. I think the expectation is that they want that lease to extend out far beyond what the compliance period is. I don't know. I have not done a New Markets Tax Credit deal that could allow something that has a shortened term than that. But you're right that maybe there's an opportunity for a shorter term on a 7-year compliance period. Pilar, do you have any input in that? If there's any possibility of a shorter term, if there's only a 7-year New Markets Tax Credit period?
Who are we looking at?
It might depend in part on how you set up the SPV. So typically they're set up as LLCs, typically state chartered LLCs, Delaware LLCs, or whatever state you're in. And so you have, even though it's owned by the tribe's going to be this, probably a single member LLC. You still have to comply with leasing regulations. And so you've still got to go through that. You will also have to consider kind of the buyout that happens, right? So the loan gets forgiven, but there's still some new accounting that has to be done so that you eventually might dissolve that LLC, and that project is no longer owned by the LLC, now is in fact owned by the tribe. So you just build in the ability to ensure that you have structure in place for however long that might take. Some tribes forget about it. Like my tribe has. I'm Pasqua. Our first LLC we did with Travois, first low-income housing tax credit we did with them. They're like, they completely forgot they had these LLCs out there. So it's, I mean, we had to change the lawyers too. So, so there's a lot of cushion built into this, and mostly just to avoid some additional transactional costs as well.
Go ahead.
Right here.
Question right here in the middle.
So I have a question. you mentioned something that really offended me, and you said gas stations wouldn't be considered critical, right?
Well, no. What I'm saying as far as.
Let me finish, let me
Yep,
finish.
yep.
So, one of the things that is important to remember why this would be critical is because oftentimes tribal gas stations in rural and remote areas, I'm thinking north central Montana, right?
Yep.
It's the only gas station in 30 miles. It's the only place to find food. It's the only place where parents can safely transact their kids, right, if they're doing that. It's a place for murdered and missing Indigenous women
Yep.
to go and find safe harbor. So I would encourage that as you continue to have this conversation, you look at it that way. So when tribes are looking at gas stations, right, and they want to upgrade those gas stations to take part in the new fuel economy
Yep.
as well as electrification, the social and economic benefits, I think, have been understated. And I
Sure.
think that's something that has to be looked at because as well as all the things that I've mentioned, in times of a disaster, gas stations are part of critical infrastructure to provide fuel for those emergency transport vehicles.
Sure.
And with that, I'll shut up.
No, I appreciate that. I think my point there is that if you're convincing a CDE that doesn't have experience with the impact of how impactful that could be within a tribal community, that CDE that's in downtown Kansas City may say, I'm not doing a gas station. We can find a better project than this. So a great example is that we recently did a project to invest in a tribally owned pizza ranch in Bemidji, Minnesota. And so you would say, okay, pizza ranch, like how is that? I'm getting a look right there, like why a pizza ranch?
Why
Well,
is Bemidji where I live?
okay, so the challenge is that there is not a single native-owned real estate business, retail business, restaurant business in the entire city. And we said, okay, this is a very viable project that is substantively important to furthering the mission of what tribes are doing in economic development and economic enhancement. And you're telling me that in Bemidji, there's not a single Native American-owned restaurant in the entire city? So that is the type of project that we're funding for that very reason. Now, it's more difficult to convince every other CDE to say, hey, like, that gas station is going to be as impactful as the language preservation project. But I absolutely hear what you're saying. It's just, there are other factors other than just the pure economics that have to be evaluated and communicated. You really play a big part in telling that story. You have to tell your CDE, whether that's Travois or someone else, how is this going to make an impact in your community? Because that's what they want to hear. Because ultimately, they're communicating that information back to the Treasury when they say, hey, look at this great pipeline of projects that we funded. Any other?
Yes, Adam.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing this knowledge with us. Question: Can projects that are already awarded under construction and have grant funding be eligible for new market tax credits?
Yeah, great question. So that's another very beneficial strategy with new markets tax credits, is that there's a 12-month look-back period as well. So you could have a project, and let's say, I'm going to use the Penobscot admin facility as an example. Fully funded, it's going to start construction here in the spring. At this point, they're assuming that there's no additional sources of funds needed. That's going to start construction. There isn't going to be allocation of new markets tax credits on the table until later this fall when the Treasury makes allocations to these CDEs. Now, that project can still benefit. It can benefit projects that are already under construction or have been under construction within the last 12 months. So you might already have a project that's complete, and let's say it was very recently completed. You could still use new markets tax credits to take out contribution or other funding sources on the project and put that money back into the tribe's project. So the housing tax credits is different in that you're typically applying for that funding and you're not really signing a construction contract until you have that equity in place. On the economic development side, you might already be down a path where that's going to happen. You can use new markets tax credits and again, benefit from that leverage, even if the project is starting now, starting soon, or going to be under construction by the time the allocations are made by the Treasury Department.
Okay, so the next question is, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah.
Applying for the new market
Yeah.
tax credit?
So again, this is like exactly what I want to talk about right here. So new markets tax credits is not a resource that you're applying directly to the Treasury Department. That's this job of CDEs. So what I would recommend first is you say to me, hey, I have a project, I'm thinking about the project, and here it is in this particular location. Very first check that I'll do is say, yes, it's in one of these geographically eligible areas. If that's the case, then it's, okay, what is the project, what's it look like, and kind of go down the path from there. But the CDE's role in that is, we're going to have, let's say we get our $60 million request. We sort of have a pipeline of projects that's assumed, but we all know that projects don't always stay on those same timelines. Sometimes they get pushed back for funding reasons, or they're over budget, or leadership changes, or whatever it is. So maybe that project gets kicked to 2 years down the road. So there's always this need, this kind of balancing act between groups like Travois and these other 200 CDEs that have allocation with projects that are shovel ready or have already started construction. So then it's sort of this much more subjective kind of relationship process where we don't necessarily have like a fixed, you don't have to apply to us on a certain timeline. You don't have to apply to Native American Bank. Native American Bank is saying, hey, look at this project is ready to go. We have allocation that can benefit. They've lined up all the other pieces of the puzzle. They need 20% more to make it possible or to take out contribution. That's where this relationship becomes very important. So sometimes it's about communicating with us. If you want to call me every 2 weeks, every week, and say, hey, like we put the project out for bid, well, then that sort of helps keep those projects on the radar of the CDE of where they are, because then when they're ready to use new markets tax credits, they've kind of positioned themselves to do so through this kind of subjective relationship process. It's not like you're applying to the Treasury. That's our job. We kind of have to figure out which projects are out there, where their status is, and how they can benefit from this resource. So again, send me an email. My contact's at the end here. If you say, hey, I'm looking at a project in this location, I can just send you a map and say, yeah, it's eligible or it's not eligible, and that's really where the conversation starts. So again, I would stress that just like on the planning side of a clean energy project, there's all these different moving parts. Well, if you go in and you start talking about QALICs and QALIC Bs and new markets tax credit investment structures to council, they're going to be like, what are you talking about? So I think a huge part of it is just education and planning on the financing side. How do all these funding mechanisms work? What is the risk? What is the actual cost? David talked about transparency, what are those costs that are going to be incurred? What are the transaction costs? How does that factor into whether or not this is a good business decision for the tribe? And I think that should be your expectation of any CDE. That's certainly the job that we're providing day to day, working with tribal councils. So typically a conversation might start and we say, hey, you're working on a project. Let's talk about it a little bit more and get some more details. Maybe you have another conversation and you bring in your team and your legal counsel, and then 3 months later, we're starting to talk with council and how this structure can work and the technical specifications of how this funding resource can get into your project. So that education piece on how all these funding resources, it absolutely has to be part of the planning and communication process, and that's something that we do every day. Again, the relationship piece, this is a really unique funding source in that everyone understands that, David Tam has a deadline and it's today at 5 o'clock p.m. And if he misses that deadline, that's it. He doesn't have another chance to apply till next year. Well, we have to be cognizant of that deadline when we're applying to the Treasury Department. But for you using new markets tax credits, it's not necessarily like that. You're trying to find a group that their mission matches up with your project and your geography, and kind of working both ways on the relationship so everyone understands where the project is so that you can benefit from this resource when it becomes available and when it's on the table. So again, we applied to the Treasury in January. We won't know about our allocation for this year until July, August, September, and then there'll be this other big chunk of money that's on the table that groups are trying to deploy into shovel-ready projects.
One question. Can you use government funds?
Yeah, so the question was, can you use government funds as the leverage? I would say that yes, in most instances. So one of the sources of funds that has come up is EDA funds. That's been a pretty frequent source on our new markets tax credit deals. EDA funds, no conflict with using new markets tax credits. Another one is the Community Facilities Loan Program through the USDA, no conflict. One that I know of for some reason is that there's a conflict with the BIA Loan Guarantee Program. That's the only program that we've run across as far as governmental sources of funds that conflicts directly with new markets tax credits. So ARPA dollars, we see absolutely zero conflict there. Other sources of funds, like we're talking about these DOE grants, presumably, like until we really get into the weeds on what those legal structures and mechanisms look like, I would say that there's not a conflict. The BIA loan guarantee is one that we know of where there is a conflict, but in general, most governmental funding sources are not a conflict with new markets tax credits, another federal program. Yeah, so this is really kind of getting into the weeds, but I think part of it goes to the 20% match requirement on a BIA loan guarantee, and that the BIA won't recognize new markets tax credit equity process. So you get like this circular argument where neither side can satisfy each other. Anyone with more technical legal expertise in the room that wants to weigh in on that particular question? Okay. I think that's the gist of it, is that the match requirement, BIA doesn't consider new markets tax credits to meet that match. So just a few questions. Typically we tell our clients $5 million minimum because of these transaction costs. Again, no hard and fast rule. So if you say, hey, we have a project that's $4 million, have a conversation, because we could still say, okay, well, maybe you need to roll in $1 million reserve, or maybe there's the opportunity to put in, maybe you're doing some initial infrastructure on that same site, and that's going to benefit future development. Could we roll that together in a new markets tax credit transaction? Plausibly, most likely, yes. So there's a lot of flexibility in what costs are included on a transaction. So healthcare facilities, another great example. This is at Levitas Air, Michigan. I'm going to flip through these kind of quick because we're right at our time limit. Insurance proceeds. Anyone from Boys Fort in the room? Their admin facility burned down. They used insurance proceeds as one of the leverage sources on a new markets tax credit transaction to rebuild their facility in Minnesota. Straight kind of office space, admin space, but you can also combine it with other things that are happening on the same timeline. So this project at Karuk, they built this new office space for their social services department. They had a wellness facility sort of on the same site that was maybe another $2 million project happening on the same timeline. They rolled the admin facility together with the wellness facility to make that one larger new markets tax credit transaction. And I think we're right at our time. So I'm going to leave it there. And again,
Yeah, thank you, Adam.
thank you for the opportunity. And if you do have questions, just feel free to come up and find me afterward. I'm happy to be a resource. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Adam. Okay, here we are, the home stretch. We're almost done. All right, our last presenter, we have Amarai Okoye from the Department of Energy. She is the U.S. Department of Energy. She is the program analyst for the Grid Deployment Office. So while we get her set up and while she makes her way down the aisle, feel free. Wow, can you tell I'm tired? I'm just a little bit tired, just a little bit. So go get you some coffee. And so without further ado, Amarai Okoye, take it from here. There you go.
Thank you. Is this working? Hello? Oh, yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Homari Aoki. It's a very difficult name, so yes. Thank you so much for sticking it out until the end today. I'm with the Grid Deployment Office under the Department of Energy. I am a program and management analyst, but thank you so much for being here. I'll be talking on a non-competitive tribal energy formula grant known as the Grid Resilience Formula Grants today. And this is one of the grants that some of the earlier speakers had mentioned today. I think Nicholas from NAFOA had spoken about it a little bit. But for today's presentation, I'll go over a brief overview of what the formula grant is. It's for preventing outages and enhancing resiliency of the electric grid. And then I'll go over a few I'll review the application process as well as answer some frequently asked questions before opening up the floor to any questions that you may have. So before we begin talking about the Grid Resilience Formula Grants, I wanted to provide an overview of the grid resilience funding that's available through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. There's $13 billion that's available for the next 5 years under the Grid Deployment Office. The one that's highlighted in red is the one that I'll be talking about today, which is the non-competitive arm. And that's available for states, U.S. territories, and Indian tribes, including Alaska Native Regional Corporations and Alaska Native Village Corporations. There's $2.3 billion for the next 5 years. And the deadline to note is March 31st. In less than 2 months, there's 2 years of funding that's available if you apply by that deadline. And I'll go over some of the key application processes. Other than that, we also have the Grid Resilience Innovation Partnership Program. This is the competitive side of the grants that we have available. The Grid Resilience Industry Grants are the complement to the formula grants. They're geared towards utility and industry. And then we also have Smart Grid Grants and Grid Innovation Program. The last two are available for tribes to apply. And the applications are staggered between March and May to allow time for applicants to apply for both of these grants. Because the Grid Resilience Innovation Partnership is competitive, I'm not able to speak on them as freely as I am with the non-competitive side for the formula grants. So if you do have any questions, they actually have to go through the Fed Connect process. So before I dive a little bit deeper into the Grid Resilience Formula Grants, I did want to provide a brief overview. These are non-competitive, and they're for projects preventing electrical outages due to disruptive events, including things like natural disasters, wildfires, and floods. The application deadline is March 31st, so it is coming up, and that is for 2 years of funding, and it's the first 2 years of funding that's available through this program. With the deadline that is approaching, this is really more to reserve the funding rather than to have specific projects ready to go. So in the application, you'll notice that we encourage you not to provide any project specifics, and you'll actually have time after the application in order to actually think about the projects themselves and develop them. And we do have sample application templates available, as well as additional resources available to assist. I'll talk a little bit more about the sample application template, and hopefully that template will make it a lot easier for you to apply for this formula grant. All right, with the Grid Resilience Formula Grant, it's driven by 4 strategic goals that are in line with Congress and the current administration. The first is to demonstrate measurable improvements in energy resilience and mitigate climate-related risk. The second is to invest in grid modernization infrastructure. And then the third is to invest in clean energy and decarbonization solutions. And then lastly, to create good-paying jobs. So with this non-competitive formula grant, there are allocations that are available to tribes. I've put up a QR code on the screen, and you can use the QR code to find the allocations for your specific tribe. They're listed in a PDF. You can also use the URL there as well. For fiscal year 2022, $96 million is available for the tribes. That's just the Indian tribe portion. And then there's other funding that's available for the states and the territories. And then for fiscal year 2023 to 2026, there'll be around $85 million available. If a tribe does not apply before the March 31st deadline, then their funds that were not allocated to them will go back into the larger pool of funding and then redistributed among the tribes for fiscal year 2024. So if you want to have the funding that is allocated to your tribe, it's important to apply by the March 31st deadline, or else it'll be shared among all the other tribes. And then just as a summary for the first 2 years of funding, there is a range. I'm sorry, this is a little bit outdated. The range for the tribal allocations is between $50 to $5 million for the first 2 years, with the majority of the tribes having allocations between $100,000 and $500,000. So yeah, you can look on the website to see what exactly your allocation is. So I wanted to also go over how the funds were allocated and how those funding allocations were determined. Because it is a formula grant, I'm sure some people are not aware of what a formula grant is. I know I wasn't sure what a formula grant was when I first heard about it. There's 5 funding factors that are used in order to create a formula to determine the funding allocation. And with this particular grant, the 5 funding factors are land area, the probability of disruptive events, the severity of those disruptive events, past expenditure on mitigation efforts, and population. So that is how you would see the differences within the allocations themselves. So this grant is primarily for preventing outages through disruptive events. With the statute, there's 12 different potential investments that are explicitly called out. And that includes things like utility pole management, wildfire mitigation efforts, monitoring and control technologies, as well as advanced modeling technologies. There are a few ineligible investments that are also called out as well, so they are also worth noting. The first is that construction of new electric generation facilities is not eligible as a project under this funding. The second is in terms of battery storage, these battery storage facilities would need to supply electricity during a disruptive event. So you would just need to have that justification if you are interested in having a battery storage facility. And then the last one is that cybersecurity measures are not eligible through this funding opportunity. But with other grid resilience opportunities, as long as you have the justification for how it would prevent the outage during a disruptive event, that could be something that we could use this funding for. With this funding, tribes do need to subgrant out to an eligible entity to execute the grid resilience projects. The eligible entities are on the screen here. They're basically what you would think of as a utility. With this formula grant, once you do receive your award, there is a process in which you could deem your own tribe or some other entity as an eligible entity. So you would submit a form and get that request. If you don't want to work with an eligible entity that's listed here, that will happen afterwards. And there is cost match requirements for both the tribe and the eligible entity that would both need to be fulfilled. So that's something to be aware of. And I'll go over the cost match requirements in a little bit. So with this funding, up to 5% of the funding can be used for technical assistance and administration. It can also be used to facilitate the distribution of information regarding the, to help reduce the consequences of disruptive events. And this 5% could be given to a third party in order to provide the technical assistance and administration as well. In this example, I have a $100,000 DOE award. And with this, 5% or $5,000 would be available for the technical assistance and administration, and then $95,000 would be available for the actual projects themselves. So with the cost match, there are two different cost match requirements with this funding opportunity. Tribes would have to provide a 15% cost match, and this could be in-kind contributions, including staff time. And the cost match can come from another entity if they're willing to help. So there have been some tribes that have had success getting the cost match from a utility or some other entity. And then with limited exceptions, federal funding would not be eligible as the cost match requirement. We have had some questions regarding that. There are a few that are available, including Self-Determination Act funding. ARPA funding as well is actually eligible as a cost match. And then the local assistance and tribal consistency fund are all eligible for cost match if that's something that you would like to use for this project. And then the 15% could be used for the resilience projects. So in this case, the funding that's available for the resilience projects would increase to $110,000. But you could also use the 15% for technical assistance and administration. So with the $100,000 DOE award example, that would increase the funding for technical assistance and administration to $20,000. So the second piece of the cost match requirement is with the eligible entity. For the most part, the cost match requirement for the eligible entity is 100% of the amount that they are given for the sub-award. However, there is a small utility cost match that lowers the amount for any subgrant entity that sells less than 4 million megawatt hours of electricity per year. And in this case, their cost match would lower to 1/3 of the amount of the subgrant award. So if they're a large entity, they would have to match 95,000 to a 95,000 sub-award. If it's a small utility, then they would match 32,000 to a $95,000 sub-award. And that would change the amount of money that is available for the investment. I wanted to go over two key components that are needed in order to apply for this grant. The first one is the program narrative. This would be the most important piece of the application, but we do have a sample document available on our website, and you can actually go and click on it. If it speaks to you, or if it follows what your tribe would like to do, then you can actually copy and paste the first 4 out of 5 pages and put it into your application. So hopefully that will help you not have to write anything. The last page is on the public hearing and notice that I'll talk about later. Adding that in shouldn't take too long. But at a minimum, it should address what kind of categories of the eligible entities your tribe wants to work with, and then what the process would be for selecting those eligible entities. So we really are trying to have a high-level application. None of the information for the projects are needed for the application itself. In fact, I would encourage you not to include any information on the project or anything about the actual cost of the project, because if you keep it high level, then you will be able to use the same program narrative for the next years. So you wouldn't have to do this over again. And then the second thing that is important is the head of government letter. It can also be a tribal council resolution or anything that's in line with your tribe's customs. But it basically is a document that appoints someone to apply for and receive and administer the awards on behalf of the tribe. There are a few additional application components. There's a few standard components that are with all federal funding, and then there's a few others that are very basic, but shouldn't take too long to complete. And some of them are optional. But I did want to highlight the two important things that need to happen before the March 31st deadline. This goes with the program narrative, and it's the public notice and the public hearing to discuss what goes into the program narrative, which should still be very high level. We have kept these two requirements very broad, so other than the fact that you have the public notice and public hearing to talk about the program narrative, we don't have any other requirements around it. So there's no minimum period for how long you have the public notice up before the public hearing happens. The public hearing can also be in person, it can be hybrid, or it can be online, it can be hybrid, it can be anything that makes sense for your tribe. And it can also be added on to a pre-existing meeting if that's something that would be helpful as well. So we've tried to make this as easy as possible to give you the flexibility. So if you have questions about the public notice and hearing, which a lot of people do, most of the time is you can do what is needed. I did want to highlight what goes into the program narrative. You can see it in the sample program narrative as well, but it does just highlight the objectives and metrics for the investments. These are provisional, so they're just things that you would think would be the objectives and metrics, and they can be changed later on. And then there's criteria for how you would select the eligible entities themselves. And again, you can copy and paste the sample program narrative if what we have written fits your tribe's needs. And then the methods for how you would solicit the projects themselves and how you distribute the funds is also included. And then there's a section on equity, on how you would make sure that there's the greatest community benefit. And then the technical assistance and administration, how you would use those funds, or how you would think you would use those funds. And then also there's a section for the evidence of the public notice and hearing itself. So now I want to switch over to some frequently asked questions. The first one is on project collaboration. We have had a lot of folks ask about whether or not multiple tribes can award funding to an eligible entity and have a larger project in order to combine their allocations and their required cost match. You can combine your funding and your cost match in order to have a larger project. The one thing that would need to happen is that all of the tribes would need to derive benefit from this project and make sure that their community is benefiting from the project that's being conducted. And then you would have to make sure that the funds are well, that we can verify that the work and the cost is not being paid twice. So you just have to make sure that those are accounted for. The second question is on consortium applications, whether a third party could submit the application for a smaller tribe. Tribes may designate a third party to prepare the grant and submit the application and administer the grant itself, and that can be done through the head of government letter or the tribal council resolution. But the grant does need to be awarded to the tribe itself, and the tribe would ultimately be responsible for completing the reporting and satisfying all of the grant requirements. Another question that we did get is on projects for individual benefit, whether or not funds could be used for to provide individual households with backup energy resources. So this formula grant is for having, the main purpose is to provide community benefit. So for the most part, the answer to whether or not you would be able to create a project for individual benefit would be no, but it would be something that we will look on a case-by-case basis. So if it is something that your tribe has looked at and has realized that the greatest community benefit would be providing individual homes specific benefits, then that might be something that we can actually use this funding for. The second one, or another one, is whether or not you can accumulate multiple allocation years of funding to create a bigger project. And the answer is yes, you can wait until year 3, year 4, year 5 to pool all of your funding from all of the years in order to create a larger project. You would just need to include that information in the program narrative that it's for multiple years. And then you can also just wait until year 4 or year 5 to think of a project itself. If you don't have a specific project in mind, you can just wait a little bit longer think about what it is that your tribe really needs before you actually create a project. So you do have additional time, not just 2 months. And then the initial DOE award has a period of performance of 5 years. So for the first 2 years, that will be 5 years. Next year, we'll add the amount of funding, next year's funding, to the original award. So you'll have a larger award at that point. And then we'll tack on another year to the period of performance. So you'll be increasing the amount of time that you have in order to actually complete the project, as long as you continue to request the funds. But with the program narrative, if you keep it broad, you don't have to do it again. You wouldn't have to do the public notice and the public hearing again, as long as everything is broad. So if your project changes, then the program narrative is still in scope. So the project would still be part of the allowable projects within your own program narrative. Oh, and I went ahead of myself. Whether or not the public hearing needs to occur every year, the answer is no, as long as the program narrative is broad enough that you allow it to cover all 5 years of funding. So I do have a few helpful resources on our website. You can apply on either the QR code or the website that's listed there, www.energy.gov/GDO/grid resilience. We do have additional resources, including some videos on how to apply, and we continue to add more resources on there as well. But I think that is it. I'll open this up to questions.
I have a few quick ones. Can a TUA, Tribal Utility Authority, be eligible as a subawardee?
Yes.
And then what if the authority's not developed yet, but it's just in planning and it's going to be developed in a year or two? Can that be kind of projected out?
So that is a question that we have raised to our general counsel. I'm currently waiting on an answer to figure out at least what the cost match would be. We're still trying to figure out whether or not, at what point a developing tribal utility authority would be considered as a small utility, but I can get back to you on that.
And then finally, I'm going to pass it over here. Is there a clawback if you don't spend the money?
So if you don't spend the money, there's not really any penalty. If you don't spend the money by year 4, we'll probably start asking you whether or not you do. If you have a plan on whether or not you're going to spend the money. The reason why is, if you don't plan on spending the money, we'll give it back to other Indian tribes. So if you just hoard the money and then don't use it, then it disappears for everyone. We're hoping that it'll go to the tribes themselves. So we'll ask you in year 4, hey, like, you haven't spent a penny of this. What are you thinking? But if you say you have a plan, then it'll be fine. There's no penalty. If in year 5 you decide that there's nothing that you want to use this funding for, then there's no penalty in that.
So I'm going to preface this. I know you're not the person that made this decision, but the fact that the Minnesota Chippewa tribes, who are 6 sovereign nations underneath that title, were not allocated in the first year, were essentially, by one person's mistake and not using your own tribal liaisons in your organization, the tribes there are missing out on $70,000 in that first year that we're hoping to recoup. But we've been told by your agency that, oops, we made a mistake. so sorry. And I want you to take that back and say the tribes need that $70,000. That's a lot of money. That's some people's allocation. And we need that. We have pretty large land base to work on. So if you could take that back for me, we're going to write letters and we're going to ask for that allocation still to come back to those 6 sovereign nations in Minnesota.
Thank you. I'll definitely take that back. And we have been talking about the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. You are in the forefront of our discussions.
That's not us. That's a different entity.
Oh.
That's a different tribe. I'm with the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe.
Okay. But yeah, we are talking about them. We're trying to figure out how we can fix this situation. But thank you. I will take that back.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. Quick question, with regards to the public notice, does that have to be a separate notice or can it be included in the agenda for a community meeting or for a tribal clerk agenda? Or does it have to be a separate notice?
It doesn't really need to be a separate notice as long as there's some sort of notice and you can put it on the program narrative how you have notified the public.
Okay.
Yeah.
No newspaper requirements and stuff like that?
No, you can use a newspaper, you can use social media if you want. There's no requirement on how you could put like flyers. It doesn't matter how you provide this notice as long as it's public.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, Michelle. Oh, sorry.
So I had a question about the utility match, right, or the amount. Typically, I guess for the tariff for the utility, and if it's on the customer side of the tariff, then the customer pays for that. So for instance, let's say a tribe wants to do a line extension or they want to do upgrade to, they're planning a building and facility and they don't have enough on their distribution side, so they have to get a transformer. Most of those today, tribes are prohibited because the costs with that are so expensive. So this type of program is great for that. But for the cost match, typically in those tariffs at the state level, it's on the customer side. So why would you require a match from the utility? What was the methodology or thought process to that? Because I would see that would be a barrier to entry for this type of project. And typically, if it was like a corporate contribution from an investor-owned utility or a muni co-op, even then, when you're looking at those types of facility upgrades on the distribution side, I'm not talking about transmission, but those numbers can be used to do a facility study or load growth, because that's what's happening with tribes. They just don't have, or those existing infrastructure are dated and old. And they do need those enhancements to do these microgrids, right? Or those types of things. Can you address that? Thank you.
So I guess the reasoning, it's kind of hard to provide a reasoning since it is written into the law. So it wasn't a decision that DOE personally was able to make for the utilities. But it is something that we have looked at. I guess I can't really give you a great answer for that. I don't.
So sometimes when federal agencies have administrative discretion, even though it's codified in legislation, is there any flexibility in that where they would have that ability with respect to that, given that if you're not getting tribes to participate because of the process or trying to find that match, is that a decision that the solicitor or the legal counsel could they assess that? Because if it wasn't written in and the language wasn't written in the sense they thought through that, is there a process in order to revisit that from an agency perspective?
So within, at least for the section, for the particular section, it is very specific. So it is really hard to change that law. may be a process to change it, but then it would have to go through Congress in order to change that law. So it's very difficult. We have raised some of the issues that we've had. We haven't been successful, but we have been getting a lot of, we understand that there are some issues, and we've heard a lot of people tell us what should be changed. But we have gone to our general counsel. We have tried to go up to the higher people, but it's been very difficult to change the law itself. So unfortunately, we haven't been able to figure out how to change the cost match requirements.
We have one back here.
Yes.
What is the, you mentioned it a little bit, what's the process for a tribe to be an eligible entity?
So with that, once you have your award, then that's when you would have the time to provide the justification for the eligible entity. That process has not been finalized yet, but it would have to go to the secretary in order to make that determination on whether an entity could be deemed as the eligible entity. So we'll provide additional information once the awards have been made and once that process has been finalized.
All right, so that comes after the application.
Yes.
Okay, and then is a tribe, if designated an eligible entity, considered a small or a large utility?
So because if a tribe is deemed an eligible entity, if they don't sell any electricity, which would most likely be the case, then they would have to provide the 100% cost match. So that on top of the 15% cost match for the grant applicant, we do know that that is a prohibitive amount. So we are trying to find other cost match resources that could be used to help provide those cost match.
Okay, and then just one more. And I think you went over this in one of your slides, but if you do not send an application in 2023, you have the ability to send applications in 24, 25, and or 26.
Yes, you would be eligible to still apply for year 3, year 4, and year 5. I do want to note that with this application, because it's non-competitive, if you submit an application and you're missing a component or we require clarification on the application, then our program officers will actually work with you and get those changes and make those updates in order for you to actually get the awards. So if like on March 31st at 10 p.m. you realize that you haven't fully completed your application, I would suggest to just submit whatever you have. I know my program officers will be mad at me if I say that, but it would be worth it to at least send whatever you have, and then we can work with you afterwards to get the information updated.
Thank you.
Okay, just one more question. So earlier on in your presentation, you had mentioned that battery backup or BESS systems were not eligible. What if they were being used for community facilities? Yeah, go ahead.
For battery storage facilities, they are eligible, except for the only thing that you need to do is to provide the justification that they will be helping with grid resiliency during disruptive events. So during natural disasters like wildfires and floods. As long as they have that component, then the battery would be eligible as an investment.
Yeah, because typically in those type of systems, it would be for the particular facility. You cannot backfeed the grid when the grid is down, because that's going to create danger for people using it. But I think actually putting the battery energy systems at community facilities would probably be a very good use of the funds, in that you'd make the community facilities more resilient.
Yes. So I guess one of the frequently asked questions that I did not include on this slide is whether or not, or maybe I did, there's a question on like a tribal health facility having a energy storage backup. That would be a eligible project, providing that it would help with the grid resiliency. And there are some tribes that were thinking about that and pooling their funding together in order to have a backup energy system available, energy storage system. Yeah.
All right. That'll do it. Thank you so much. Amari Okoye.
Aoki.
Aoki. I keep getting that wrong. I'm so sorry. But thank you once again for a wonderful presentation. Thank you for all of our guests for joining us today. We hope to see you tomorrow. Well, not hope. We will see you tomorrow morning for a half day. We'll be going from 8, registration starts at 8, and then we'll be going from 9 to noon. All right, so see you all. Safe travels to your various hotels and residences.